All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the December session of DC-AAPOR's Book Club 2.0. This session is being recorded and will be posted on the DC-AAPOR YouTube channel, like all of our book club sessions. So today's meeting is with James Druckman, where he'll be telling us more about his book, Experimental Thinking, a primer on social science experiments. Thanks so much for joining us today, Jamie. I'm Melissa Sedade, your host for this session. The Book Club 2.0 is a series brought to you by your DC-AAPOR program committee. For those unfamiliar with the series, the format's pretty simple. First, Jamie will present on his motivation for the book along with some highlights and key insights. During that part, please mute your microphones, but utilize the chat feature in Zoom. You can use the chat box to post thoughts or questions as they arise. Then we'll open up the floor for discussion, where we'll start with the items from the chat box and then open it up more generally. If you're comfortable at that time, please feel free to turn on your cameras and ask your questions or provide feedback directly. You're also welcome to contribute reactions and comments to each other, as this is a discussion and not solely a Q&A. At the end of the hour, I'll announce the name of the DCA-POR member who's won a copy of today's book. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our guest. So Jamie Druckman is the Martin Brewer Anderson Professor of Political Science at the University of Rochester. He studies public opinion formation, political polarization, political and scientific communication, political psychology, and experimental survey methods. He's published approximately 200 articles and 7 books, and apparently never sleeps. His most recent book is Partisan Hostility and American Democracy, explaining political divisions and why they matter. And he co-edited Public Opinion Quarterly from 2008 to 2012. And so with that, I'm going to pass the floor over to Professor Druckman when you're ready.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here, and I really appreciate it. So about how long should I aim for to talk?
Yeah, so we, sorry, we usually go for about 30 to 40 minutes.
Okay, great. Yeah, because I could. Yeah, that sounds great. I will be watching the clock then. Yeah, thank you again for all spending your afternoon during a very busy time of the year here. So hopefully everybody can see that now. And so as Melissa said, this is well, uh-oh.
Okay, so we can see your
Sorry.
notes. Yep, you might want to
Yeah,
switch your.
sorry. I don't know. Oh, right. Sorry about I don't know what the can you see it now?
It's not in presenter mode. We can see, but
Yeah, it
yeah.
seems every time I try to switch to presenter mode, it gets a little crazy. I'll try one more time and then I'll
Okay,
just use this mode if it's not.
okay.
That's I think that's still not working, right?
Yes, it's the same view.
I
Okay,
I'm sorry.
no worries.
Um, I don't know what the technical issue is. But hopefully this will be okay. So yes, this is a book that I wrote and came out in 2022, and hopefully I'll kind of the motivation for doing so will become clear as I start. And so one starting point is this quote, which is fairly amusing, fairly kind of telling perhaps of the time period. This is from a very famous quasi-experimental design book. This was the predecessor to the famous Cook and Campbell or the Shadish et al. Book by Campbell and Stanley. We must justify experimentation on more pessimistic grounds, not as a panacea, but rather as the only available route to cumulative progress. We must instill in our students the expectations of tedium and disappointment and the duty of thorough persistence. We must expand our students' vow of poverty to include not only the willingness to accept poverty of finances, but also a poverty of experimental results. So I don't know how many people stayed in graduate school after reading this quote, but I think it's a pretty telling quote of kind of the status of what experimentation was like for a lot of the history of the social sciences. And specifically, it was really hard to do experimentation. So if you look out on political scientists, so if you look at the first experimental article published in the American Political Science Review, it was in 1956. That is a random assignment experiment. There were some non-random assignment studies that were preceded it. This experiment relied on 50 students, 4 staff members, and about 400 hours of work to study 500 people. Then there's kind of a Chantal Iyengar and colleagues' classic 1982 article on agenda setting that included all of 28 subjects. The first paper that I published that used an experiment in 2001 was a 264 student sample, and it took 5 months to collect the data. And then also, of course, for much of this period, so I'm talking about roughly a period from 1963 when I put up that quote to about 2010 or so. If you got no results, you would put them in the file drawer, and there was not a lot of consideration. I mean, obviously there were exceptions, and people were talking about this back in the 70s, but for the most part, no results were seen as results that weren't worth pursuing. And this is completely shifted. By the time we got to the 2010s, we had a very different atmosphere. Specifically, we had an enormous number of data opportunities, including crowdsourcing, sourcing platforms, social media, elite samples. We had computing advances that allowed us to use very large data sets when possible. The replication, the kind of so-called replication crisis, led people to realize that no results, if properly implemented in studies, might be quite interesting. And so the whole kind of landscape of how we thought about experimentation acutely and obviously data collection more generally had really shifted by this point of time. And of course, this is consistent with what's going on in the survey world as well. But this introduces a kind of a new challenge in some sense. And again, this is kind of the motivation for why I wrote this book. And the possibility when it comes to experimentation is a new kind of what you might call possible poverty. And specifically, has become so easy for many people to collect data and design experiments that you start to see poor designs and inappropriate analysis and use of lots of data and very flawed interpretations. And so, in essence, what I kind of had started to see, particularly often among students, and I'm also the co-principal investigator of time-sharing experiments in the social sciences, where we get applications for survey experiments, and I started seeing this a lot, was that there just was not a lot of thought into the design of what these studies look like. And there was kind of this attitude of, look, the more data I have, then I'll be fine. And obviously, you can have an infinite amount of data, and that's not going to compensate if you don't have a good design in place. And so the book is a primer, and I'm not going to obviously talk through the whole book. I'll talk through selected parts and kind of watching the time. But it starts off with a motivation, and then it kind of places experiments in the larger scientific process. It talks about how to think about experiments in terms of realism and validity and samples, which I'll talk about some of this in a moment. It talks about some innovation in experimental designs, which I'm not going to really talk about, but some very specific designs that are being used a lot in the contemporary times. It talks then about, I titled it What to Do Before, During, and After Experiment, which is really about pre-registration and then implementations questions, and then some things about replication, which I might get to if I have time, and then kind of a summary of kind of advice on designing a good experiment, at least from my perspective. And so what I'll talk about today, watching the time again, is very briefly the evolution of experiments, re-emphasizing some of the things that I touched on. Then I'll talk about credibility and generalizability. And then I'll talk about replication and then how to design a good experiment. That's the full set of things I might touch upon. And so just kind of talking about the rise of experiments, again, going back to kind of what I've already intimated, this is just, you could take any journal that's not a psychology journal, which, psychology is a bit distinct in terms of they were using lab experiments. This is from the American Political Science Review, and this is just the count of the number of articles in the journal that used experiments from the 1950s through to about 2019. And what you see this kind of huge, and this isn't the cumulative number, this is the actual number by decade. And you see this huge uptick kind of once you cross into the 2010s. And so, that's consistent with what I mentioned earlier. Again, I think a lot of this stemmed from technological change. We saw the rise of crowdsourcing platforms. We could do these large scale studies. There's this one study from 2012 that had 61 million Facebook users on it. We could do things in the field, so we could use portable computers to have lab and field studies, or we could do surveys in different contexts on tablets. And of course, we had high-powered computing as well. And then kind of around the same time, this maybe tangentially contributed to the rise in experiments, but it certainly contributed to how we thought about experiments, was the reemergence of the open science movement. I say reemergence insofar as the movement itself has a history going back to the 1700s. But kind of the modern open science movement, which really focuses on And obviously in APOR, they were talking about standards of transparency, I think, before open science really took off in this time period. But it's really an emphasis on transparency and citation standards and data analytic and material transparency, pre-registration, and replication, which kind of altered things insofar as how people thought about publication, bias, replication, and transparency. And so, in short, you kind of had these three different things, this confluence of a rise and expansion of experiments across the social sciences. It became really a primary method. You saw technological change, which really opened up design and data possibilities. And then you saw sociological change, which also the expectations of how we should practice research. And that kind of led to what I think about as a new era of experimental social science. And, I think particularly relevant for APOR is that, when you kind of look at which types of experiments, because you have lab or you have field or you have survey experiments. Survey experimentation is really the workhorse of the change. That was really the type that really started to increase most dramatically, and so it has relevance for that reason. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn to talk about the credibility and generalizability of experimental research, which in some sense it's very basic, but in another sense, my impression from my experiences, again, with students and the time-sharing experiments and editing experiences, is that people kind of would misconstrue or kind of think about credibility and generalizability in ways that I thought were not necessarily the most productive ways. So just a few important matters to kind of talk about. So first, kind of just talking about how to evaluate experiments and how to kind of think about realism in those experiments. And there's a lot of conversation. There's always a lot of conversation as to does the experiment resemble something in the real world, or what we might call mundane realism. And that is an important thing if you are testing a policy intervention. So if you're doing a policy evaluation and you're trying to look at kind of how that's policy or kind of how some intervention, program evaluation of some sort is affecting outcomes, then, in an education setting, for example, then mundane realism is important because you want it to resemble what that intervention actually looks like. But outside of that domain, mundane realism is really not an important priority, I think, for experimentation. Instead, I think the focus should be more on constructing treatments that resemble the constructs that we're interested in. So another way, I think you have to remember that when you're constructing an experimental treatment, again, outside of the exception of when you're doing a program evaluation of sorts, what you're really trying to do is simply manipulate values of the independent variable so you can make a strong causal statement about the effect of that independent variable. How you go about manipulating that independent variable is usually not as important as the fact that you are actually manipulating that independent variable. And I'll give you an example of this in a moment. So what that means is, if the way you go about manipulating that does not necessarily, if it doesn't resemble something that one might say, I see in the real world, that's not necessarily a problem per se, because what you're trying to do is not emulate something that you see, but you're emulating kind of variation in that independent variable of interest. So what that also means is that attention is kind of, you think about attention a little bit differently in experimental context than you might in observational context. And this is a quote from a recent article by John Kane. He says, attentiveness is often a precondition for having an efficacious treatment. And so you want to have attentive respondents. So even though there are inattentive individuals, of course, in the population, you want to have people who are attentive because the point of the experiment is to manipulate those values of an independent variable. And if people are not being attentive to the manipulation, then you're not manipulating that. And so your manipulation has failed. And so the point of the experiment is kind of undermined in that sense. And so in a way, experimentalists talk about this as experimental realism. So instead of mundane realism, where you might resemble something that you see, experimental realism is the idea that the people in the experiment are taking the experiment seriously and are reacting in the ways that the treatment is intending them to react to it. And so what we see then is that we have to often go and do a lot of pilot testing to see that any particular manipulation is having the effect that we think it should have, or include manipulation checks, where we, after the manipulation in the actual study, we see if the people have responded or have kind of processed the manipulation in the ways that we intended them to do so. One caveat here is that you cannot remove people who don't pass a manipulation check, right? Because then you're no longer balanced across the random assignment in the experiment. So to give you an example, I'm in the middle of, this is something I'm working on now. It's a study of kind of reactions to protests, and it's building on this work that has shown that people react very differently to protests depending on if the protesters are portrayed as being mostly white or if the protesters are being portrayed as mostly black, and whether or not the protest is violent or not violent. So I'm trying to vary here both the race of the protesters as well as whether or not there is violence in the protest or not. So this is one example of the article. There's no need to really read the whole article. The important thing here is that here there is no suggestion of protests. I'm sorry, there is no suggestion of violence in this article. So this is the non-violent article. The violent article explicitly talks about. I'm sorry, this is actually the violent one. Sorry, this is the clash with police and threw a rock that shattered a Capitol building. So we want people to perceive that this protest was actually violent. Whether or not this article resembles a news article that actually would be published in a newspaper is less important than people perceive a protest that took place as being violent specifically. Because I'm trying to look at the variation between a violent protest and a non-violent protest and kind of people's perceptions and kind of how they react to the policy that's being protested about. And then we vary race, but based on kind of a name and the quote that we have in the article, you can see at the end, right, we use a common approach, which is to use names that are commonly associated or perceived to be from white individuals or names that are commonly associated or perceived to be from black individuals. And then we also include a picture. And so this is a picture from the condition that has white individuals as the main protesters. And the work, if you're interested, this is building on work that suggests that when the protesters are peaceful, but black individuals, people perceive it as more violent than they do when it is white individuals, and in fact, as violent as when it's as violent as when it is a violent white individual protest. And so we're building on this type of work. And so again, the manipulation here is we want people to have different beliefs in terms of violence or nonviolence and the race of the protesters. And so we put in a manipulation check after they see the treatment. Did protesters clash with police? And so in this manipulation, it should be yes. And what was the name of the demonstrator that was quoted in the article? So again, we really want to make sure people are seeing these things in the manipulation, because that's what we're trying to get at. And so it's really important for us that people are attentive to this manipulation. And so that's kind of one aspect of evaluating credibility and generalizability. Another aspect is to talk about generalization. And so what people often think about is external validity when it comes to experimentation. And this is also a bit of a tricky thing. And so I kind of think about it as there are four questions that one should ask when they're thinking specifically about experimentation and the extent to which something generalizes. And this is often not the way we think about observational research. So the first question one might ask is, what is being generalized? And so in an experiment, you're trying to look at a causal relationship. And so the question is, are you trying to generalize the existence of a causal relationship or an experimental effect, or are you trying to generalize the precise size of that effect? And that's quite a big difference, right? So in the example that I just showed you before, we're looking, for example, at perceptions of how violent these people are as one of the outcome variables. Are we interested in kind of how the race of the protesters, does it affect perceptions of violence? Or are we interested in the exact size of the relationship between the race of the protesters and the perceptions of violence? And this makes a very large difference, because it then kind of comes back to how you are conducting the study and exactly, for example, what kind of sample you're using. So if you're using a kind of a opt-in non-probability sample, those are often going to be fine for estimating the existence of an experimental effect. I'll come back to this in a little bit about samples. But if you want to estimate the precise size of an experimental effect, you have to be much more attuned to kind of the representativeness of the sample. Again, I'm going to come back to talking about sampling in a moment, because I'm simplifying a little bit right there. So that's one question to ask. Another question is, to what exactly are you trying to generalize? And we often think a lot about the populations to which we're trying to generalize, but it's also important to think about the settings to which we're trying to generalize. and the causal variables that we're trying to generalize to. And so there's kind of more dimensions of generalization that we might think about. And specifically coming to the fourth question, what dimensions are exactly the most important? Is the sample the most important thing that you're trying to generalize about? Am I trying to generalize about kind of all people who engage in protest, or are the settings more important? Am I trying to generalize to kind of urban protests specifically versus protests not in urban settings? Treatments, am I trying to generalize across any type of operationalization of violence, for example, and outcome measures? And so again, we need to think about generalization. What I see a lot is people talking about like, oh, does the experiment, is there mundane realism? Is it kind of matching what I might see in a protest in the so-called real world? When in fact, if we're really trying to measure reactions to the violence of a protest or not, we want to have a very stimulus with a lot of experimental realism. And then we really need to ask these questions as well about kind of what are we trying to generalize, to what are we generalizing, which dimensions are important, and then also what's the counterfactual that we're trying to generalize about. So for example, in the study that I just mentioned, I'm trying to compare the presence of violence or non-violence protests. And kind of that's the comparison that I'm putting forth. We could have imagined a different study that would look at different types of violence protests or the absence of any protest whatsoever, right? I don't, in the design that I've been describing, there's not a pure control group, for example. And so you really have to think very careful about the counterfactuals that you're putting forth. And one sign about this, which is a pretty good heuristic when you're reading an experimental paper or writing an experimental paper, is when hypotheses are put forth, they should always be very explicit about the comparisons being made. So for example, in the example that I just have been using, the hypothesis would be relative to a setting where most of the protesters are white, settings in which most of the protesters are black, people observing those protests would perceive them to be more violent. And so I want to be very explicit about the comparison. I don't want to have hypotheses such as protests with black individuals are seen as more violent, because I don't know what I'm comparing that to. And in an experiment, because the essence of the design is that you're choosing a counterfactual by what you're doing with the treatment, you want to be very explicit that it maps onto whatever hypothesis that you're having. And so I guess the point is that generalization, when it comes to experimentation, it's a lot more nuanced and a bit multidimensional than I see in many discussions of that. Let me talk briefly about samples since I mentioned this. And I could skip over the side. Everybody here knows the difference between these different types of samples. One of the things of note, as everybody here would know, right, this is just from Pew, a lot of you have probably seen this, is there's been this enormous, this is from polling, but we could do this with experimentation, and this would even be a larger gap. There's been this enormous rise of online opt-in samples. And so these are non-probability samples. They range from being from crowdsourcing platforms to you can get them from vendors who are going to provide you with some kind of a important approach to quotas and then probably weighting. And so we really have to think very carefully about what kinds of inferences are being drawn from these types of samples. And obviously, there's a lot of discussion of this in the survey world about what kinds of inferences and comparisons with probability sample. And we have a pretty good sense of that, these samples, regardless of adjustments, don't really match the benchmarks that we have in probability samples. At least that seems to be the kind of the presumed wisdom at the moment, as far as I can tell. When it comes to experimentation, it's a little bit different. And the difference lies in part from if you think about what you're trying to generalize, right? The sample is important for generalizing, right? You're generalizing to a certain population. And in a non-experimental study, you're trying to typically generalize some kind of a population parameter that describes that population, but it's typically just a descriptor of the population. For example, the percent of people who have a certain characteristic. In an experiment, you're trying to very precisely to generalize the causal relationship. That is so right. If we just think of a simple regression model where we're regressing an outcome variable on whether or not people were exposed to the treatment, we're really interested in generalizing to what extent does that coefficient on the treatment, to what extent does that hold in the population? And so when we think about it like this, we have three different scenarios we're in. And I'm going to come back to the opt-in in a moment. If that treatment effect is homogeneous, that means that it affects everybody in the exact same way. So let's say that everybody exposed to a violent protest or a nonviolent protest, it reacts in the exact same way, regardless of their individual characteristics. Then it doesn't matter what kind of sample we have, right? Ranging from a kind of convenient student sample to the best high-end probability sample, we're going to find the same treatment effect size, right? It's going to, because it doesn't depend on who's in the sample, then we're going to always find the same effect size. And so in cases like that, the sample actually then for an experimentation doesn't really matter. Of course, in reality, there are probably not a lot of cases like that if you kind of stand back and think about it. So that leaves us in kind of two situations. One is where the treatment effect is heterogeneous, and we kind of can model that heterogeneity. So we think about the treatment effect might depend, for example, on the race of the respondent. Then we need to make sure we have a sample with some type of sufficient variance in the sample. So for example, in the example I've been using, we might think that the reactions to the violence or nonviolence is going to depend on the age of the respondent. If it depends on the age of the respondent and we're using a student sample, we're going to very badly misestimate the treatment effect. If we have a sample that's a non-probability sample, but it has variance on the age, and we model that heterogeneity, then we can at least have some estimate of the treatment effect contingent on that heterogeneity in age. So what's really the key thing here is when we have an experiment, when we think about samples, is there enough variance on the key potential moderators that could affect the treatment effect? So hopefully that's fairly clear. I know it's a little bit abstracted away, but it means that we want to make sure that we have samples that have observed heterogeneity on things that we think might affect the treatment effect. The really tricky thing here, which is kind of more art than science, is what is sufficient variance. We don't necessarily have a great understanding in most domains of exactly kind of where the variance lies. Like, does it lie kind of at the lower end of the continuum? Like, where in the age continuum are we going to see the variance, and kind of does the sample pick that up or not? And that's where it becomes a little bit difficult to know what kinds of samples to be using. But there are a few implications of this. One implication is that I'm going to come back to the need for probability samples in a moment. But one implication is that for thinking about non-probability samples in experimental research is a little bit of a different undertaking than thinking about non-probability samples in non-experimental research. And specifically, I don't know if lower bar is the right characterization, but for the sake of kind of simplicity, I'll just say that it's a bit of a lower bar insofar as we're talking about, especially if we're just trying to find if there's evidence of a causal relationship and not trying to pinpoint the exact size of that causal relationship. What that means is that as long as we have a sample that has a fair amount of variance on the conceivable moderators, then we are in reasonable shape to make a good causal estimate of an experimental effect. And so in that sense, when we see a lot of experimentation on non-probability opt-in type samples, in many cases, that seems to be a perfectly reasonable way to go, particularly when you're not really concerned with getting the precise effect size of the relationship. I keep saying this caveat of when you're not interested in the precise effect size, because if you're interested in the precise effect size, right, even if you're kind of a little bit off on age, or you're off on some kind of unmeasured covariate in a non-probability sample, you might then misestimate the exact size of the effect. So that's a case where you might have to be a little bit more careful about the sample that you're choosing. And so I'm going to skip over this. I will say I have slides, but for time reasons, I'm going to skip over this. I have been this is not in the book. It's in a paper that's a working paper right now where we took 9 different opt-in samples and we evaluated various aspects of these opt-in samples, and particularly for experimental research. And I'll just skip right to the conclusions of this because I think it's quite interesting. One is these included Prolific, Mechanical Turk, Lucid, Connect, Cloud Research, and a few others. And we are looking at various metrics, including response validity, data quality type measures, and then also representativeness, and then how well did it replicate experiments that had been done on probability platforms. And we found there was a lot of variation across these samples. And so opt-in samples are not all the same. So we need to think about them in very differently. It also was quite interesting. We found a negative relationship between overall response validity or data quality and representativeness. So in other words, the samples that tended to be more representative, like they use more quotas, for example, they tended to have lower quality responses. And we're quite certain, although we couldn't literally pin this down, it seems fairly obvious that this is because the samples that get more balance and kind of more representativeness are using mobile phones, but mobile phones undermine response validity. And so there's a little bit of a tension there in terms of what's more important for you. And from an experimental standpoint, as I was talking about it, it's a hard trade-off because you want to make sure there's attentiveness, and so you want high response validity and kind of quality respondents. But again, you also want to have that variance, and so there's a little bit of a tension there. But what we also found is that if we use front-end filters, and I'll come back to this in a moment, if we just filter out inattentive participants by having two front-end attention checks, and then we just drop people from the study if they don't pass these attention checks, that doesn't affect the representativeness of any of the samples, and it boosts response validity quite a bit. And so this is an important point for experimentation, and again, differentiates experimentation from other types of work in an important way. Because what we're doing here is that we are dropping respondents because they fail attention checks. And obviously, if you're drawing a probability sample, that's a very questionable activity to be engaging in. And I've talked to some of the people at Amerispeak, and they're interesting conversations about this. Because right, as soon as you start to drop people, you don't know who you're dropping, and even if it looks good on observables, it's plausible that you're kind of dropping people on unobservables that matter. And so if you're really trying to get a precise estimate or you're doing more observational work, that could be highly problematic. But in experimental work, again, especially when we're trying to estimate just the existence of a causal relationship, this really doesn't seem to be a problematic practice to engage in. The likelihood of you kind of dropping some aspect that has an important source of variance on the heterogeneity of an effect is very low. So this seems to be a practice that I would recommend insofar as if you're doing experimental research, particularly when you're just trying to document whether or not there's an effect or not, using these front-end attentive checks, even when you have quotas, doesn't seem to affect the representative of the sample, and it leads to a much higher data quality in that sense. And so again, that's a summary of kind of this exercise that we went through. I will very briefly turn to one last point that I touch on in the book in some detail. And I put a plug in for time sharing experiments in the social sciences, which some of you might be familiar with. This is a survey experiment on a probability sample. You can apply. It's funded by the National Science Foundation. You can apply. Your proposal is then peer reviewed, and then if you're accepted, we field the experiment for you for free on the Amerispeak panel from NORC. And I think there are lots of reasons why we want to keep doing experiments on probability samples. One is so we have a benchmark. Two is so we have samples that have broad heterogeneity, look at variation in treatment effects. And then three, we did find in the exercise that I did, that I just talked about across these 9 samples, we're finding pretty high variance in kind of the effect size estimates across all of those samples. And so it's good to kind of keep a gold standard going in some sense. But the last thing I'll talk about is replication, and I'll do this pretty briefly. But this has kind of become a pretty widely discussed topic. Obviously, maybe not as widely discussed as it was some years ago. But right, there was the pretty widely covered study in 2015 where they had more than 200 scholars trying to replicate 100 experiments from psychology, and they only replicated about 39% of those experiments, and this led to this so-called crisis of replication. So I just want to kind of situate, kind of thinking about replication, and then I'll kind of leave it at that. So when you think about replication, there's a lot of different ways we can think about replication, and I like this kind of characterization from Fries and Peterson. They talk about it in terms of kind of, are you doing a similar study or a different study, and are you using data that's already existed, or are you collecting new data? If you're using data that's already existed, then you're really just looking to verify, reproduce, kind of the reanalyze the data. You should get the same results. If you're using a different method, for example, with old data, then you're looking at robustness. I think when people talk about replication in kind of this domain, though, they're usually talking about using new data, and they're usually doing something that's a very similar design. So they're trying to repeat the exact aspects of the design, or they're trying to do something that's a different design. So they're trying to generalize. So the point I want to make is that we often talk about replication as falling in this repeatability cell, when in fact we often don't really know if we're kind of tending towards or even fully in this generalization cell. And I'll say, let me explain why that's so. So so replication is very difficult in experimentation. So in experimentation, right, the idea is that experimentation is very useful because we can make a causal statement, or put another way, from a potential outcomes framework, we're solving the fundamental problem, or we're addressing the fundamental problem of causation by random assignment. And so what I'm introducing is what I would call a fundamental problem of replication. And specifically, right, the third bullet point there is just simply the fundamental problem of causation, which is basically you want to know kind of what a unit would look like when they are treated versus what that same unit would look like when they are not treated. And is there a significant difference between those two things? We resolve that in experimentation by looking at averages across randomly assigned groups. The problem when it comes to replication is basically we want to see if when we did this in the original study, do we get the same outcome when we do it in the replication study? So that's pretty straightforward. So that's kind of the replication cell, or going back to this, that's a repeatability cell, which I think a lot of people just call replication in experimentation. And that seems pretty straightforward. Here is where I think it gets quite complicated. Coming back to talking about generalization, when you do the original experiment, we have to think that the experiment is kind of subject or a function of the elements of external validity that I talked about earlier, which are pretty commonly understood. So what result you get depends on the sample you use, the treatment you use, the outcome you use, and the context in which the data were collected. And so put another way, that outcome in that original study is a function of all those dimensions of external validity. And then when we do the replication, even if we use the exact same study material, it's still going to be a function potentially of these different elements, or at least some subset of these different elements. And so when it comes to replication, you're kind of in this world then where to have a successful replication, you need to repeat the finding, but you have to also assume that when you're running the replication, that these elements of external validity have been invariant. Put another way, that the samples are exactly comparable, the treatments are exactly comparable, which they presumably should be if you're using the same material. The outcomes need to be exactly comparable. Even if you're using the same measure, are you presenting it in the same way in the interface? And then the tricky one often is the context exactly comparable. And that's where you start to not know, right? When I'm replicating this study, am I really repeating it? Or am I kind of going into the generalization cell where I'm actually looking at, like, does this finding actually hold in a different context or with a different sample or with a slightly different outcome characterization? And in fact, kind of along these lines, there was a paper by Jay Van Wevel who went back to the 100 replication study, psychology study, and he pulled out the ones that they thought would be most sensitive to context. And he found those were the ones that were least likely to replicate. And so I think that was a pretty good example of where what we think is kind of strict replication, we often don't know when it's replication or when it's generalization. And so, that's kind of, I think there's a lot more nuance talking about replication. And, again, we can kind of talk about this in survey experimental settings where there have been a lot of efforts to replicate things. And I think it's often unclear when there's a strict replication and when we are actually in that generalization cell. And so I think I'll try to kind of finish up on this note. As I mentioned, there are other parts of the book where I talk about specific design. I talk about publication bias. I talk about kind of the kind of nuts and bolts of kind of the steps that one undertakes to conduct an experiment from the very beginning. So I really try to situate experiments as kind of a later part of the research process. So, he starts like, how do you ask a question, and kind of how do you then theorize and arrive at hypotheses, and kind of all those steps. So I'm really trying to kind of put experimentation in kind of it's one part of this very large process. And what I had observed over time with this kind of plethora of data that people can access is that they collect a lot of data without going through those prior steps that lead to a good design. And again, I think we could say this about any survey design, right? I think this is something that is not unique to experimentation. For those who are kind of my age and older, when you were designing a survey, you would want to be equally very careful because you knew you wouldn't get another chance to collect more data so easily, and it would be expensive and time consuming. But now, right, if you go on a crowdsourced platform and you collect some data, and something seems off, you just collect more data. It's not particularly expensive and it's pretty easy. And the problem is that that kind of undermines the incentives to kind of be a little bit more careful on how you design things. And I think this has obviously been an evolving thing, right? People kind of my generation, right? People kind of a generation older than I would say like, well, you don't have to go to like a mainframe computer and put in the cards. So, we had to be more careful than you. But I think it's really been kind of the ease of data collection has made me a little bit nervous in kind of what that's done to how experimental design has worked. And so that's really kind of the theme of the book. And so I think I will finish with that. I hope that kind of made some sense. I know I talked very quickly. And so I will stop sharing on that point.
That was terrific. Thank you so much. Okay, so let's turn our attention to the chat box. Looks like we have a question here on education level, age, and other aspects impact ability to judge the respondents' inattentiveness and attentiveness. In other words, might the inattentiveness question's level of complexity and requirement for memory screen out people who actually may be attentive? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think I followed it up to the last aspect of that. And so if I understood the question right, are you screening out people kind of on distinct demographics or not? And so in terms of that, that's a really great question, and that was one of the questions we were really interested in the study that I talked about, where we looked at these 9 platforms, because the question is inattentiveness a function of a certain characteristics of, or at least measurable characteristics of respondents, or is attentiveness kind of a class of respondents who are basically professionals who might be inattentive? And what we, again, I don't want to overgeneralize at all. We did this study. I mean, we did it. It was on 9 platforms, so it was a lot of data. It was about 32,000 people, but it was also at one point in time. It was one study, and what we found in that study is fairly consistently across all the platforms. It did not, attentiveness did not correlate very well with any particular measurable demographic characteristic. Rather, what it was really a function of, at least again on these platforms, where there was some level of professionalism on these platforms, although that varied. By professionalism, I mean people who take surveys often. And so that varied between like the platform with the least professionalism. The average person took maybe 5 surveys in the last month, which is still probably non-trivial and probably more than a lot of us. And then at the high end, like there were people, I think the average was like 100 surveys. I think on MTurk, I think Open MTurk is like they're just taking surveys as a source of income. It really correlated with that. So like increases in professionalism correlated with lower attentiveness. And then mobile phone usage, when you were using a mobile phone, it led to increased inattentiveness. And so we did not find any measurable demographic, at least to a point. We had a lot of attention checks in the study. Once you had like 5 or 6, the people who passed like all of them, then it did start to correlate right with various demographics. So you're right, I would strongly recommend against having way too many attention checks, because then you really start to change the nature of your sample. So, but the simple upfront ones, it didn't seem to have, at least on these platforms, opt-in platforms, it didn't seem to correlate with those measurable characteristics.
Oh,
But
interesting.
I think it's a great question. It's a really important topic to look at across lots of different data sources.
Yeah. And that's one of the things you mentioned in the book, right? Is that it's not enough to do a single experiment and say, look, we have a finding. It's the culmination or accumulation of multiple experiments. Can you talk a
Yes.
little bit more about that process of iteration and experimental design?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Thank you. I appreciate you mentioning that too. Yeah, I'll talk about it in 2 senses. I mean, there's kind of the accumulation of kind of building experimentations within one's own research trajectory. And I'll give a little story of my own experience. And specifically, right, the first experiment, or one of the first experiments I ever did, which was the one I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, that where I had 254 respondents or so. Basically what I did was I took a prior experiment that Tom Nelson, who's a political scientist at Ohio State, had done. He was this was before the days of, right, everybody would share all of their material, and he was extremely generous, and he kind of shared all his experimental material with me. And I, changed things in a way to test some other aspect of something. And so I was kind of built upon what he had done and kind of had a theory about something that I thought kind of the source of the information might affect the reaction to that information. And so he didn't vary that. So I introduced that variation. And so I think in building an experimental trajectory, I always really suggested, and at least what I've done, is really kind of built upon things that have already been done. They might have been done by yourself, or they might have been done by somebody else. But experimentation, I it's a funny thing. When I teach experimentation, I always kind of suggest there are an infinite number of ways to mess up an experiment. And so if you can draw on material that's been kind of rigorously evaluated and tested and probably piloted, and you kind of use that for the purposes to extend it, that's often a very good approach to do. Just like in writing a survey, right? I think everybody would recommend, don't just write a question out of your mind, right? Look at the questions that have been done, think about kind of best, survey practice, and then try to kind of consider those two things and come up with the best question. It's the same thing. And again, with experimental treatment is an exercise in measurement, right? I think we often don't think about treatments as measurement, but we think about them as in terms of measurement. And so that's one aspect of kind of accumulation. Another aspect is accumulation of larger research agendas. That's a particularly interesting question in this day and age, because you see more and more meta-analyses done across different fields, and we've obviously seen a lot of those in the survey community for some time, particularly when it comes to important methodological features of surveys. You're seeing more of them, I think, at least in political science, and I think a little bit in sociology, on substantive topics. And I think 2 points, I guess, I'd make. One point is I kind of emphasized a lot earlier on, like, when are you trying to estimate an exact effect size, like an exact precise relationship? And I made it sound as if like you could do that from one study, one experiment, if you had like a really good probability sample and everything was really great. But even in that case, you really should not do that, right? Like if you want to estimate like an effect size, you want to have that accumulated over time and ultimately, ideally, in a meta-analysis, right? Which is exactly the purpose of a meta-analysis. The flip side of that is meta-analyses. I don't know what the current state of training in meta-analyses is. Certainly, I am unaware of a political. I'd be welcome to be corrected, but I'm unaware of a political science department that offers an explicit course on meta-analyses. So, right, I was at Northwestern for a lot of years, and we were fortunate there because there was a statistician, Larry Hedges, who's one of the leaders in meta-analysis. So there was like a social science course in meta-analysis, but I even think that was pretty rare.
Oh, yeah.
And the reason I'm bringing this up is because the meta-analyses, there, there's a science to it which has to be learned, and then there's also an art to it which I think can be taught. And the art being like what studies go with what studies, and I think that's hard. And so as we move towards accumulating more studies, I wish there'd be more care in that, in evaluating in these. So.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Okay, so I see there's a question in the chat from Noreen. Noreen, did you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Yeah, I can certainly do that. Hi, Jamie.
I know.
So I actually just wanted to see if there is a process. Would you always replace inattentive respondents, or are there some situation in which you would replace them and other situations where you would not, and you would use your sample as it filters out after the checks have been conducted? Are there some rules in place? Is there certain studies and certain ways, certain methodologies where you would do one versus the other?
So based on the early attention response checks, so we're talking about attention, not
Yes.
yes,
Yeah, we're talking about detention response checks.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think, um, in an experimental setting, I typically would say that you want to have attentive respondents to a point, at least that we're able to respond to too early filters on attention checks. Again, because if they're not attending to the risk is if they're not attending to the manipulation, um, then you're basically underestimating a treatment effect because there's just noise in your data. And so, it's kind of so I'll give you a comparison. So if we were just doing an observational study and we had a bunch of inattentive respondents, like we're going to have a response set problem. We're going to end up with kind of a lot of acquiescence bias, for example. And so we're going to end up kind of inflating certain correlations because of these inattentive respondents.
Mhm.
So the question in that case would be, do we want to throw out those inattentive respondents or not? If you're trying to make an estimate to a population about how they respond to a given survey, maybe not. I don't know. I mean, that's a hard question. It depends on the purpose of your study. So I think that becomes tricky there. In the domain of experimentation, though, because we are trying to really estimate kind of the effect of this manipulated variable, if we're not manipulating that variable successfully, then we're basically not really testing what we think we're testing. And so in that sense, I think these kind of very easy front-end filters are a worthwhile thing to do. And my understanding is that, at least with Amerispeak, I want to be very careful in kind of talking about what their practices are. But I think that they do some data quality cleaning in a very sophisticated and careful way. So even when we're talking about a probability sample, there is some attention to kind of making sure that you're not having people who are just speeding right through to pass. So I guess that's a very kind of non-committal, windy answer. But I guess my bottom line is they're the same kind of questions that come up in survey research generally, but I think in experimental research, there's a little bit of a stronger rationale for filtering out, at least at the front end.
Got it. And even if you were to filter it out, would you replace them necessarily?
Replace them, drop them, and replace. Yeah. So keep them in the experiment, but then drop and replace them. Yeah. I
Because
think
in
that's a
my head, when I think about respondents not
yeah.
being attentive, there is step one of just removing them from your sample, and then step two would be replacing them in your sample. Would you necessarily do both? Would you do
Yeah,
one and not the other?
that's a really great question. So typically what I would do is I would drop them if they right when they fail the checks. Um, and then they're gone, and most vendors will not charge you for them. Um, but there is a loss of information when you do that, right?
Mhm.
Because often, particularly if you're using a panel, you can at least kind of know who these inattentive respondents are if you let them finish your study. And so they're, it's kind of like throwing out information about non-respondents. It's a little bit like that, which is something we wouldn't want to be doing. That's a great question. I have to think about that a little bit more. A lot of times I just kind of drop them in because I don't want to pay for them, but there would be some gain to keeping them. You would probably learn a lot more about who they are. We kept them in the study that I talked about because we wanted to see this effect, but generally speaking, I wouldn't keep them. So yeah, it's a great question.
That's great. Thank you.
So it kind of just depends on how you want to proceed and whether or not you want to pay for them, correct?
Yes, I think that's right. If you want to pay for
Makes
that
sense.
information, that you, yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks, Jimmy.
Yeah. It always comes down to resource allocation, right?
Absolutely
Yeah.
does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. I think we have time for one more question if anybody has anything they want to ask. Okay. So then I had a question that I wanted to ask. As I mentioned, I really enjoyed the discussion of experimental realism and the centrality of that, that the experiment simulate reality, right? This sort of simulation piece. But I've struggled in my work to induce that in respondents, especially when I have to get explicit consent to participate in the study, right? And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about inducing realism in experiments. How do you make it real for respondents?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think there's a lot. It's a very profound question in a way because there's a lot of dimensions to that. One is um, in terms of kind of who are you getting to take. So if you're collecting your data and you're inviting people to take your study, how do you even advertise your study? And so kind of I would even step back to that point. And so how are you kind of describing your study? Are you describing it in a way, using kind of what we would know from like social exchange in terms of getting people into your study? And I always try to do that as much as possible because if you get respondents coming into the study who are kind of interested in the study and interested in being in the study, I think that always improves engagement. So even if I'm, you know, paying for data, obviously you want to say you're being paid and compensated, but I always try to kind of make it clear, like what's to the extent that you don't want, there might be information you don't want to share, but to the extent that it's okay to share for the study perspective, the more you can kind of succinctly tell people something that's interesting about what they're doing and why it's beneficial, I think that sets the stage for more engagement. I also think, starting with some kind of front end, I mean, this is probably fairly typical, but, starting with some kind of not too long, but kind of front end easy questions, easy demographic questions, kind of gets the person kind of moving. Keeping survey experiments have the advantage of often being relatively short, which also keeps engagement, I think, up. You very rare you're going to get something over like 15 minutes or so, which I think is important. Um, I said you want to start with some basic demographics. Sometimes you want a lot of information about the characteristics of the respondent. Lots of times the vendor has that in their panel data. So if you're using a vendor that's like an online panel, you get that data. And so A, you don't have to pay for the time, and B, you're not asking people things that they've already answered in other surveys for that company. So that keeps them more engaged. And then there's, I think, what you're ultimately getting at, which is how do you design treatments that are engaging? I think visuals are engaging. Shorter is better. I was part of this very large study where we were testing interventions to reduce polarization, and they could be up to 8 minutes. And clearly, the ones that were all text and like we had much higher attrition on
Oh, yeah.
those. So we had like fairly high levels of differential attrition. And I think some of the things, again, it depends on what you're doing, but things with video and sound seem to keep people much more engaged.
No, I,
So
I
yeah,
love that advice to go back to the recruitment materials in the first place. That's great. All right, that's terrific. A big thank you so much to Jamie Druckman for participating in this series, and thanks to all of you for making today a success. So, the DCA-AAPOR member that has won a copy of today's book is Serena Lowe. We'll be in touch with you shortly to get your details for sending you a copy of the book, and congratulations. Just a quick note that our next event will be the annual DCA-AAPOR Holiday Party held on Thursday, January 9th at Clyde's of Gallery Place. Keep your eyes out for an announcement and registration for this event because it's always a fun one. And a closing thought. This is my last book club as your DCA-AAPOR program chair. Over the last year, we've organized 5 book club meetings, 2 webinars, 1 election panel, 1 conference, and 1 happy hour. And I've been so honored and privileged to get to bring our community together professionally and socially. I'm so delighted and excited to see what our next program chair, the incredible Stephanie Coffey, has in store for us next year. And thank you all so much for the support. It's been my pleasure and honor. So, with that, thank you all. Have a wonderful afternoon, and hopefully, your holidays are relaxing. See you soon.
thank
Thank
you.
you.